The winter Klaus Reinhardt's cabin stayed at 56 degrees, while his neighbors froze at 20 below. Men stopped laughing about the hole he had dug into the mountain. What happened in the 8 months before that impossible winter would transform how settlers built shelters across the entire volcanic frontier. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten wilderness innovation move you, hit that subscribe button. Because tomorrow's story might be the most unbelievable one yet. The door to Otto Brenner's cabin stood open when Klaus Reinhardt arrived on the morning of February 9, 1851. Snow had drifted into the doorway during the night, and the interior temperature felt no different from the air outside. Klaus found Otto sitting in his chair near the fireplace, frozen solid, his hands still reaching toward wood that lay stacked within arm's length. The fire had gone out sometime during the night. Otto had not been able to restart it before the cold took him. Klaus stood in the doorway for several minutes, trying to understand what he was seeing. Otto Brenner was not a careless man. He was 52 years old, a German immigrant who had survived 14 winters in the Oregon Territory. He knew how to maintain a fire. He knew how to prepare for cold nights, yet he had frozen to death inside his own cabin with a full woodpile less than 10 feet from where he sat. The cabin itself offered clues to what had happened. The walls were traditional notched log construction, well built by frontier standards. The chinking between logs appeared intact. The door fit reasonably well in its frame. The roof showed no obvious gaps. By all conventional measures, this was an adequate shelter, but adequate was not the same as survivable. Klaus had visited Otto 3 days earlier. The old trapper had been complaining about the cold, mentioning that he could not seem to keep the cabin warm no matter how much wood he burned. Klaus had attributed this to Otto's age, assuming the man simply felt the cold more acutely than younger men. Now, standing in the frozen cabin, Klaus realized the problem had nothing to do with Otto's age and everything to do with physics he did not yet understand. He examined the fireplace. The design was standard for the region, river stones mortared with clay, a firebox large enough to burn substantial logs, a chimney extending through the roof. Klaus knelt and felt the stones. They were cold, completely cold, as if no fire had burned there in days rather than hours. He placed his hand on the log walls. They felt like ice. The entire structure had become a cold sink, drawing heat from any source and radiating it into the winter night. Klaus spent an hour in that cabin, studying everything while Otto's body sat frozen in the chair. He measured the gaps between logs with his fingers. He examined how the corners were notched. He looked at the door and window construction. He paid attention to the fireplace stones and how much mass they represented. Most importantly, he began thinking about heat not as something that simply existed when you burned wood, but as something that moved, that transferred, that could be lost faster than it could be generated. Other trappers and settlers arrived throughout the morning. They helped Klaus prepare Otto's body and discussed burial, which would have to wait until the ground thawed. They talked about the cold snap and how brutal this particular winter had been. Several mentioned that they too were struggling to keep their cabins warm despite burning wood constantly. Everyone accepted this as simply the reality of frontier life. You burned wood, you stayed as warm as possible, and sometimes the cold won. Klaus said nothing during these conversations, but something had changed in how he saw the world around him. Every cabin in the region was built essentially the same way Otto's had been built. Every cabin was losing heat, faster than fires could replace it. Every cabin was a potential death trap during severe cold, and everyone simply accepted this as inevitable. Klaus returned to his own cabin that evening and did something no other trapper in the region had thought to do. He began counting. He counted how many logs he burned in a night to maintain barely tolerable temperatures. He counted how many hours each log lasted. He counted how many times he woke to feed the fire. The numbers told a story that disturbed him deeply. On an average winter night, Klaus burned approximately 16 logs between sunset and sunrise. Each log was roughly 14 inches in diameter and 20 inches long. He had cut, split, and hauled every one of those logs himself. The labor represented in a single night's heating was substantial. The labor represented in a full winter was staggering. He began tracking his wood consumption against the outdoor temperature. When the temperature dropped to 20 below zero, as it had, the night Otto died, Klaus burned 23 logs to keep his cabin barely warm enough to prevent freezing. Even then, the interior temperature probably never exceeded 35 degrees. Water in his bucket froze solid 6 feet from the fireplace. His breath created frost on the inside of his window. Klaus was not an educated man in the formal sense. He had attended school through the 6th grade in Bavaria before his family immigrated to America when he was 13. But he understood basic mathematics, and the mathematics of his situation were straightforward and brutal. His cabin was approximately 16 feet by 20 feet, with walls 8 feet high. The total wall area was roughly 576 square feet, not counting the roof. Every square foot of that wall surface was transferring heat from inside to outside at a rate determined by the temperature difference and the insulating value of the logs. He did not know the formal physics equations, but he understood the principle. The colder it got outside, the faster his cabin lost heat. The faster it lost heat, the more wood he had to burn. There was a point, he realized, where no amount of wood burning could keep up with heat loss. Otto had reached that point. The old man had burned wood until exhaustion overcame him, and then the cold had won. Klaus spent 3 weeks after Otto's death obsessing over this problem. He talked to other trappers about their wood consumption. Most burned similar amounts, some even more. Several admitted they were worried about running out of wood before winter ended. One man, Friedrich Vogel, mentioned that he was considering abandoning his claim and moving to a lower elevation where winters were less severe. The consensus among the trapping community was that this winter was exceptionally harsh, and next winter would likely be milder. Klaus disagreed but kept his thoughts private. The problem was not the severity of this particular winter. The problem was that their shelters were fundamentally inadequate for the environment they lived in. Traditional cabin construction had developed in regions with milder winters. Transplanted to the high elevations of volcanic Oregon territory, those traditional methods were insufficient. Men were trying to survive using techniques designed for different conditions, and some of them, like Otto, were dying because of it. Klaus found the lava tube on March 3, 1851, while tracking an elk through an area he rarely visited. The animal had led him into a section of broken volcanic terrain about 4 miles from his cabin, an area where ancient lava flows had created a landscape of sharp rocks, sudden drop-offs, and scattered patches of forest growing in pockets of accumulated soil. He lost the elk's trail near a low cliff of black basalt rock. While searching for tracks, he noticed an opening in the rock face, roughly 6 feet high and 8 feet wide, like a mouth opening into darkness. Klaus had seen similar formations before. The entire region was volcanic, built from eruptions that had occurred thousands of years ago. Lava tubes were common, created when molten rock flowed through cooling lava, leaving tunnel systems behind after the eruptions ceased. Most trappers avoided these formations. They could be unstable. They sometimes housed bears or mountain lions. They led into confusing underground passages where a man could become lost. Klaus had no intention of exploring the tunnel that day, but something made him pause at the entrance. The air coming from the tunnel was noticeably warmer than the surrounding forest air. It was early March. Snow still covered the ground. The outdoor temperature was probably 15 degrees, but the air flowing gently from the lava tube felt closer to 40 degrees, maybe warmer. Klaus stepped just inside the entrance, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. The tunnel extended back into the rock, curving slightly so he could not see how far it went. The walls were black volcanic glass, smooth in some places, rough and broken in others. The floor was relatively level, covered with a layer of fine volcanic dust. The ceiling height varied from 7 feet to nearly 10 feet. He stood there for several minutes, feeling the temperature difference. Then he walked back outside and stood in the cold wind, then back inside the tunnel. The difference was unmistakable and remarkable. The tunnel was significantly warmer than the outside air, and Klaus had brought no fire, no heat source. The warmth was simply there, existing in the rock itself. He marked the location carefully in his mind, noting distinctive landmarks. Then he continued his hunt, but his mind was no longer focused on elk. That evening he returned to his cabin and thought about what he had discovered. The next morning he went back to the lava tube, this time bringing a thermometer he had purchased years earlier in Portland but rarely used. Outside temperature at mid-morning, 18 degrees. Temperature 10 feet inside the lava tube, 43 degrees. A difference of 25 degrees with no fire, no insulation, no human intervention. Klaus sat at the tunnel entrance for 2 hours, watching, thinking, beginning to understand something that would change everything. Klaus returned to the lava tube every day for the next 2 weeks. He brought different tools each time: his thermometer, a rope measured in 10-foot increments, candles for light in the deeper sections, and a journal where he recorded observations in careful German script that slowly shifted to English as he ran out of German words for what he was seeing. The tunnel extended back into the hillside for approximately 180 feet before ending in a collapse of rock and soil. The dimensions varied throughout its length, but a section about 60 feet from the entrance maintained consistent height and width of roughly 8 feet by 10 feet, with a relatively flat floor and intact ceiling. This section, Klaus noted, stayed at a nearly constant 45 degrees regardless of outside temperature fluctuations. He began conducting experiments. On March 15th, the outside temperature was 12 degrees. The lava tube interior remained at 44 degrees. On March 19th, an unusually warm day brought the outside temperature to 38 degrees. The lava tube interior stayed at 46 degrees, barely changing. The rock, Klaus realized, was acting as a massive temperature regulator, absorbing and releasing heat so slowly that daily weather variations barely affected it. He started noticing other trappers watching him. Herman Wolf, a quiet man who trapped the territory north of Klaus's claim, stopped by one evening and asked directly what Klaus was doing, spending so much time at the rock formation. Klaus tried to explain about the temperature difference, about the heat storage properties of the volcanic rock. Herman listened politely, but clearly thought Klaus was dwelling too much on Otto's death and needed to return to normal trapping activities. Friedrich Vogel was less diplomatic. He encountered Klaus emerging from the lava tube one afternoon and made jokes about Klaus living in a cave like a bear. Several other trappers were present, and they laughed. Friedrich suggested that if Klaus wanted to be warm, he should move to California like sensible men who could not handle real winters. Klaus did not argue. He simply continued his observations. He began bringing his fire-starting materials into the tunnel, building small fires at various locations, watching how the smoke behaved, how the heat dispersed, how long the rock walls retained warmth after the fire died. He discovered that a modest fire, much smaller than what he burned in his cabin, could raise the tunnel temperature to 60 degrees. More importantly, the rock walls absorbed that heat and continued radiating it for hours after the fire went out. By early April, Klaus had filled 30 pages in his journal with measurements, sketches, and observations. He had calculated the approximate volume of rock surrounding the tunnel and estimated its heat storage capacity based on experiments heating smaller rocks in his cabin fireplace. The turning point came on April 23rd, when Klaus announced his intention to abandon his current cabin and build a new shelter at the lava tube. He made this announcement at a gathering of trappers who had come together to discuss the spring fur prices and coordinate their trips to Portland to sell pelts. Friedrich Vogel was the first to respond. He asked Klaus to clarify what he meant by building at the lava tube. Klaus explained that he would not build a traditional four-walled cabin. Instead, He would seal the entrance to the lava tube with a single log wall, creating a shelter where three sides were solid volcanic rock and only the front required construction. The silence that followed this explanation lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Then Friedrich began laughing. Within moments, the entire gathering was laughing, except for Hermann Wolf, who watched Klaus with a concerned expression. Friedrich asked if Klaus intended to hibernate like a bear. Another trapper suggested Klaus was admitting he lacked the skill to build a proper cabin. A third wondered aloud if grief over Otto's death had damaged Klaus's judgment. The jokes continued for several minutes, each one building on the previous, each one positioning Klaus as either incompetent, cowardly, or mentally unwell. Klaus attempted to explain the thermal mass principle he had discovered. He described his temperature measurements, the heat retention properties of volcanic rock, the potential for maintaining livable temperatures with minimal firewood. He might as well have been speaking German. The trappers listened with expressions ranging from confusion to pity to contempt. Friedrich, who had emerged as Klaus's primary critic, made an argument that resonated with the others. Real men built real cabins. 4 walls, proper construction, standing independent of natural features. Hiding inside a cave was something animals did. Settlers and trappers proved their worth by conquering the wilderness, not by crawling into holes in the ground. Building a traditional cabin demonstrated competence, self-sufficiency, and courage. What Klaus proposed demonstrated the opposite of all 3 virtues. The cultural argument proved more powerful than Klaus's technical explanations. Frontier society valued certain visible markers of capability. A well-built cabin said something about the man who built it. Klaus's proposed shelter would look like an admission of weakness, regardless of its thermal performance. Several trappers suggested Klaus should reconsider. Hermann Wolf, speaking quietly after the others had made their opinions clear, acknowledged that Klaus's temperature measurements were interesting but questioned whether they justified abandoning conventional construction. Even Hermann, who was not hostile, clearly doubted the wisdom of Klaus's plan. Klaus left the gathering knowing he had convinced no one. The social cost of his decision was now clear. If he proceeded with building at the lava tube, he would be marked as the community eccentric at best, incompetent or cowardly at worst. His reputation, carefully built over 9 years in the territory, would suffer significant damage. He returned to his cabin that night and looked at his journal filled with measurements and observations. The mathematics were undeniable. The temperature differences were real. The potential for survival during extreme cold was genuine. Klaus made his decision based not on social acceptance, but on arithmetic and physics. Klaus spent the month of May conducting experiments that would provide the foundation for his construction technique. He cleared a space behind his existing cabin and built a test structure, a miniature version of what he planned to create at the lava tube. He constructed a simple frame 8 feet wide, 6 feet deep, and 7 feet tall. For the back and side walls, he stacked river rocks dry, without mortar, creating 3 walls of stone approximately 18 inches thick. For the front wall, he built a tight log wall, using the best timber selection and fitting techniques he knew. He created a small door and included a tiny window. The roof was simple split planks covered with bark. Inside this test structure, he installed his thermometer and conducted week-long heating experiments. He would build a fire of known size using counted logs, maintain it for measured periods, then let it die, and record how long the structure retained heat. He repeated these tests multiple times, varying the fire size, duration, and outdoor temperature conditions. The results confirmed what he had observed in the lava tube but provided specific data he could use for planning. A fire burning 3 logs over 2 hours raised the interior temperature to 68 degrees when the outside temperature was 45 degrees. After the fire died completely, the rock walls continued radiating heat for 9 hours, during which time the interior temperature dropped to 52 degrees. The rock had absorbed heat energy and was releasing it slowly, exactly as Klaus had theorized. he compared this to his existing cabin's performance. A fire burning 3 logs over 2 hours in his cabin raised the temperature to approximately 55 degrees with the same outside temperature. Within 2 hours after the fire died, the cabin temperature had dropped to 48 degrees. The log walls, while providing some insulation, stored almost no heat. They were barriers to heat transfer, but not heat batteries. Klaus began understanding the distinction between insulation and thermal mass. His log cabin walls insulated, meaning they slowed heat transfer, but did not store heat energy. The rock walls both insulated and stored heat, creating a fundamentally different thermal behavior. The rock absorbed heat when the interior was warm and released it when the interior cooled, moderating temperature swings automatically. He conducted additional experiments with different rock types. The black basalt from the lava tube region retained heat longer than the river rocks he had used in his test structure. He heated pieces of basalt in his fireplace, then timed how long they remained warm enough to feel. Large basalt rocks stayed warm for over 6 hours after removal from direct heat. By late May, Klaus had developed an intuitive understanding of principles that would not be formally described by physicists for several more decades. He knew that mass mattered, that denser rocks stored more heat. He knew that surface area mattered, that more rock surface exposed to interior air meant faster heat transfer in both directions. On June 1, 1851, Klaus began dismantling his existing cabin. He removed everything salvageable: the door, the window frame, iron hardware, tools stored inside, his few pieces of furniture, pelts, and supplies. He stacked these items under a canvas tarp near the lava tube location. Then, he abandoned the cabin structure itself, leaving it standing empty. This act shocked the local trapping community more than his earlier announcements had. A standing cabin represented significant value. The labor invested in cutting, hauling, and fitting logs was substantial. Traditional practice when relocating was to either sell the cabin to another settler or completely dismantle it and reuse every log. Klaus did neither. He simply walked away from months of work, leaving the structure standing as if it had no value at all. Friedrich Vogel visited Klaus at the lava tube site 3 days after Klaus had moved his supplies. Friedrich made one final attempt to talk Klaus out of what Friedrich considered a catastrophic mistake. He pointed out that Klaus was destroying his reputation, that future trading partners might question his judgment, that potential partners for trapping expeditions might avoid him. Klaus listened respectfully, then explained his reasoning one more time. He described Otto's frozen body, the arithmetic of wood consumption versus heat generation, the temperature measurements from the lava tube. He showed Friedrich his journal with its careful data. He invited Friedrich to place his hand on the lava tube wall and feel the warmth that existed without fire. Friedrich examined the journal without reading it carefully. He touched the rock wall briefly. Then he made an argument that revealed the fundamental disconnect between his worldview and Klaus's. Friedrich said that frontier life was hard, that men died sometimes, that this was the cost of freedom and opportunity. Trying to avoid hardship by hiding in caves was contrary to the pioneer spirit. Real strength came from facing challenges directly, not from seeking easy solutions. Klaus recognized that no amount of data would bridge this philosophical gap. Friedrich saw Klaus's innovation as weakness. Klaus saw traditional construction as lethal stubbornness. They were speaking different languages despite using the same words. Hermann Wolff took a different approach. He visited a week later, after Klaus had already begun construction. Hermann did not mock or argue. Instead, he asked practical questions. How would Klaus prevent moisture accumulation on the rock walls? How would he ventilate smoke from the fireplace? What would he do if the tunnel proved unstable? These were engineering questions, not philosophical objections. Klaus appreciated Hermann's approach and answered each question thoroughly. He had solutions for moisture control, ventilation, and structural stability. He had thought through the practical challenges because he had spent 2 months studying the specific site rather than generalizing from assumptions. Hermann remained skeptical but not hostile. He told Klaus he hoped the experiment succeeded, but feared Klaus was taking an enormous risk based on incomplete understanding. Then he offered assistance if Klaus needed help with heavy lifting during construction. Klaus began construction on June 15, 1851. The approach was unlike anything attempted in the Oregon Territory. Where traditional cabin builders started with corner posts and worked outward, Klaus started with the lava tube itself and worked inward, treating the volcanic rock as 3 completed walls that simply needed a 4th wall to seal them. The first challenge was selecting the optimal location within the tunnel for his front wall. Too close to the entrance, and he would sacrifice the thermal benefits of being deeper in the rock mass. Too far back, and he would be working in darkness with poor ventilation. Klaus chose a location 42 feet from the tunnel mouth, where the ceiling height was consistent at 8 feet and the width was 10 feet. This gave him a living space approximately 10 feet wide, 12 feet deep, and 8 feet tall. He began by preparing the floor. The volcanic dust that covered the tunnel floor needed removal down to solid rock. Klaus spent 4 days shoveling dust, carrying it outside in leather buckets. When he reached bedrock, he found the surface relatively level but uneven. He filled low spots with small rocks and tamped them firm, creating a floor that would not shift or settle. Next came the critical task of marking where his log wall would meet the rock. The tunnel walls were irregular, not straight vertical surfaces. Klaus needed to create a seal between organic-shaped volcanic rock and geometric human construction. He took a long stick and held it vertically against the rock at multiple points, measuring the variations. Then he used charcoal to mark the rock surface where his logs would terminate. The log selection process was obsessive. Klaus rejected any log with significant taper, knots near the ends, or irregular shape. He needed logs that could be fitted together with minimal gaps and shaped to match the irregular rock surface. He spent 2 weeks cutting and hauling logs from a stand of straight pine 3 miles from the site. Other trappers who saw him working commented that he was taking more time selecting logs than most men took building entire cabins. He stripped each log completely using a draw knife, removing all bark and shaping the logs to consistent diameter. Each log took 6 hours to prepare. Klaus was building a wall only 10 feet wide, requiring approximately 12 logs for full height. He prepared 18 logs, giving himself options for selecting the best fits during actual construction. The first log placement took an entire day. Klaus positioned it at ground level, then used his draw knife to shape the log ends to match the irregular rock surfaces on both sides. The fit needed to be tight enough that minimal chinking would be required. He worked slowly, cutting small amounts of wood, testing the fit, cutting more, testing again. When he finally set the first log in place, it matched the rock contour so precisely that a knife blade would not fit between wood and stone. The junction between log wall and volcanic rock represented the most critical structural challenge Klaus faced. Traditional cabin building relied on corner joints where all logs were wood meeting wood. Klaus was creating a hybrid structure where shaped wood met irregular stone, and any gap in this junction would create heat loss that would undermine his entire design. He began developing a custom chinking mixture specifically for the wood-to-stone interface. Standard moss and mud chinking would fail in this application. Moss compressed unevenly and left gaps. Mud cracked as it dried and fell out over time. Klaus needed something that would seal permanently, withstand freeze-thaw cycles, remain flexible enough to accommodate minor structural movement, and bond to both wood and rock. He started with clay from a deposit he had found near the creek. Pure clay cracked badly as it dried, so he began adding materials to prevent cracking. He tried horsehair, as some cabin builders used, but found it clumped and did not distribute evenly through the clay. He experimented with shredded bark, grass fibers, and small stones. None performed adequately. The breakthrough came when Klaus remembered seeing indigenous people using pitch for waterproofing. He collected pine resin, boiling it down to remove moisture and increase viscosity. Then he mixed the concentrated resin with clay in various proportions. A mixture of 3 parts clay to 1 part resin created a substance that remained pliable while wet but hardened to a tough, slightly flexible seal when dry. The resin gave the clay adhesive properties that made it stick to both wood and rock. Klaus added one more ingredient: fine, volcanic ash from the tunnel floor. The ash acted as an aggregate, giving the mixture body and reducing shrinkage. His final formula was 3 parts clay, 1 part pine resin, and 1 part volcanic ash mixed with water to workable consistency. He tested this mixture on sample pieces before using it in actual construction. He sealed joints between wood scraps and rock pieces, then subjected these test samples to heat, cold, moisture, and physical stress. The mixture performed well in all conditions. It bonded strongly to both materials, showed minimal cracking, and remained intact through multiple freeze-thaw cycles. Application required careful technique. Klaus applied the mixture while it was still warm and pliable from the boiling process. He packed it into the gap between log and rock using a wooden tool he carved specifically for this purpose, working the mixture deep into irregularities in the rock surface. Each log required approximately 2 hours of chinking work, sealing both the log-to-rock junction and the log-to-log joints on the horizontal surfaces. As the logs stacked higher, the irregular rock surface created varying gap widths. Some sections required only minimal chinking. Other areas had gaps up to 3 inches wide where the rock curved away from the straight log surface. Klaus filled these larger gaps first with small rocks, then sealed everything with his chinking mixture. By mid-July, he had completed the log wall to full height. The door represented both an engineering challenge and a symbolic statement. It would be the only point of entry, the primary source of heat loss, and the most visible element of Klaus's unconventional shelter. He approached its construction with the same obsessive attention to detail that characterized his entire project. He started with a single massive pine log, 30 inches in diameter, that he had marked months earlier. The tree had fallen naturally during a winter storm, and the wood had seasoned for over a year. Klaus sectioned a 4-foot length from the straightest portion of the trunk. Then, using wedges and careful splitting technique, he created planks approximately 4 inches thick. The door required 6 planks, each 4 feet tall, and varying in width from 6 to 10 inches. Klaus shaped each plank so the edges were perfectly straight and parallel. Then he cut a groove along one edge of each plank and a matching tongue along the opposite edge. When assembled, the planks interlocked, creating a door that functioned as a single, solid piece. He reinforced the door with 3 horizontal crosspieces on the interior face. Set into shallow dados, he cut across all 6 planks. These crosspieces were secured with wooden pegs driven through from the exterior and wedged tight. The finished door weighed approximately 70 pounds but was rigid and warp-resistant. The hinges were simple but effective. Klaus carved wooden pintles that fit into iron brackets he had traded for in Portland. Years earlier, the pintles allowed the door to swing freely while being strong enough to support the weight. He mounted the hinges using a technique he had observed on warehouse doors, mortising them into both the door edge and the log frame so they could not be torn free without destroying the wood itself. The window placement required calculation. Klaus needed natural light and ventilation, but wanted to minimize heat loss. He positioned the window 5 feet above the floor on the southern exposure of his front wall, where it would receive maximum sunlight. The opening was small, only 12 inches wide and 18 inches tall, cut through a single log to avoid creating a weakness at a joint. He created a shutter using the same thick plank construction as the door, scaled down to window size. The shutter was hinged on the interior and could be secured closed with a wooden bar. Behind the shutter, Klaus installed a frame that held a covering made from scraped deer hide soaked in rendered bear fat. The translucent hide allowed diffused light to enter while blocking wind and providing insulation. The door frame received special attention where it met the rock walls. Klaus carved the frame timbers to match the rock contours, then sealed the junctions with extra applications of his clay resin ash mixture. When completed, the door and frame were effectively integrated into the rock structure, not simply attached to it. Smoke management presented Klaus with a challenge that threatened his entire design. Every shelter needed a way to evacuate smoke from cooking and heating fires. Traditional cabins used stone or mud fireplaces with chimneys extending through the roof. Klaus could not simply build a traditional chimney because he had no roof in the conventional sense. The lava tube ceiling was solid volcanic rock. He spent 3 days studying the tunnel's natural airflow patterns. He lit small, smoky fires at various locations and watched how the smoke moved. The tunnel had subtle air currents, presumably created by temperature differences between the deep interior and the entrance. Smoke tended to rise and flow toward the entrance, but the movement was slow and would not adequately clear a living space. Klaus needed to create a draft system that would pull smoke out while retaining heat inside. His solution was unconventional but thermally sound. He built his fireplace against the rock wall on the northern side of his living space, using river stones mortared with clay. The firebox was relatively small, designed for efficient fires rather than massive blazes. Instead of building a vertical chimney, Klaus created an angled flue that ran along the tunnel ceiling toward the entrance. He constructed this flue from flat stones, creating an enclosed passage approximately 8 inches square. The flue followed the ceiling for 30 feet, gradually dropping in elevation until it exited through a carefully positioned opening he had chiseled in the rock near the tunnel entrance. The design was brilliant in its simplicity. Smoke rose from the fireplace into the flue and traveled along the ceiling toward the outside, but the 30-foot length of the flue meant the smoke was in contact with the rock mass for an extended period. Heat from the smoke transferred into the rock, warming the tunnel ceiling while the smoke itself cooled. By the time smoke exited the tunnel, much of its heat had been deposited in the rock rather than lost to the outside air. Klaus added refinements. He included a damper mechanism near the fireplace, a flat stone that could be slid partially across the flue opening to control draft. Too much draft would pull heat out too quickly. Too little would allow smoke to accumulate. The damper allowed adjustment based on fire size and outdoor conditions. He also created a secondary air intake, a narrow channel that brought fresh air from outside directly to the fireplace. This prevented the fire from pulling warm air from the living space to feed combustion. Cold outside air entered through the dedicated channel, fed the fire, then exited as warm smoke through the flue. Klaus completed construction on August 27, 1851. He moved his belongings into the lava tube shelter and began living there full-time. The structure looked strange from the outside, a single log wall with a heavy door and small window, set into what appeared to be a hillside of black rock. To anyone unfamiliar with the interior, it looked like Klaus had simply sealed a cave entrance and decided to live like an animal. On September 3rd, Klaus invited the local trapping community to inspect his completed shelter. 7 men came, including Friedrich Vogel and Hermann Wolf. Klaus gave them a tour, explaining each design element. He showed them the rock walls that formed 3 sides of his living space. He demonstrated the door's construction and the chinking that sealed wood to stone. He explained the smoke flue system and how it deposited heat into the ceiling rock. The trappers examined everything, with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed mockery. Friedrich made jokes about the low ceiling, suggesting Klaus would have to stoop like a troll, living under a bridge. Another trapper questioned whether the rock walls would sweat moisture and create unhealthy dampness. A third wondered aloud what Klaus would do when the tunnel collapsed and buried him alive. Klaus addressed each concern with specific technical explanations. The ceiling height was adequate for comfortable living. Moisture condensation would be minimal because the rock temperature would stabilize close to the interior air temperature. The tunnel had stood for thousands of years and showed no signs of structural instability. His answers were logical and well considered, but they did not persuade his audience. Then Klaus made a statement that would define the next 4 months. He told the assembled trappers that his shelter would maintain interior temperatures at least 70 degrees warmer than their traditional cabins during the coldest part of winter, and he would accomplish this while burning less than half the firewood they would consume. The claim was so bold that it briefly silenced the group. Then Friedrich laughed and called it impossible. The others joined in. Basic arithmetic made Klaus's claim absurd. Everyone knew how much wood was required to heat a cabin through winter. Klaus's shelter was not noticeably smaller than a standard cabin. There was no logical reason it would require half the firewood while maintaining temperatures 70 degrees warmer. Klaus explained thermal mass theory one more time. He described how the rock absorbed and stored heat, how the mass moderated temperature swings, how the system required only enough fire to maintain the rock temperature rather than constantly fighting heat loss through wooden walls. He might as well have been describing magic. The trappers listened politely but clearly considered his explanation nonsense. Friedrich proposed a wager. When winter came, he would visit Klaus's shelter with a thermometer. He would measure Klaus's interior temperature and then measure his own cabin's interior temperature under similar outdoor conditions. If Klaus's shelter was indeed 70 degrees warmer, Friedrich would publicly acknowledge that Klaus had been right. If not, Klaus would admit his cave dwelling was a failure and return to traditional construction methods. Klaus accepted the wager immediately. October brought the first cold weather. Night temperatures began dropping into the 20s, and morning frost persisted through midday. Klaus began burning fires in his shelter's fireplace, carefully observing the thermal performance of his design. The initial results were promising, but not yet dramatic. With a modest fire burning 3 logs over approximately 2 hours each evening, Klaus maintained an interior temperature around 55 degrees, while outside temperatures dropped to 25 degrees. A 30-degree difference was respectable, but nowhere near the 70-degree difference he had claimed. Klaus was not concerned. The rock mass had spent the entire summer at ambient temperature, absorbing the seasonal warmth. Now that mass needed to cool to equilibrium with the changing seasons. He understood that his shelter's true performance would only become apparent after the rock had stabilized at winter temperatures, and he was maintaining those temperatures against extreme cold rather than moderate autumn weather. Hermann Wolf visited in late October and asked how the shelter was performing. Klaus explained the thermal lag concept, that the massive rock walls were still releasing summer heat and had not yet reached their winter equilibrium state. Hermann listened with genuine interest, though he admitted he did not fully understand the physics Klaus described. He did. Note that Klaus's wood consumption appeared modest compared to what Hermann was already burning in his own cabin. Klaus continued his measurements, recording daily observations in his journal. Outside temperature, inside temperature, fire duration, wood consumed, subjective comfort level. The data began showing patterns. The rock walls were indeed storing heat from his fires and releasing it slowly. His interior temperature varied only about 10 degrees between warmest and coolest points of the day, while outdoor temperatures swung 40 degrees or more between daytime highs and nighttime lows. By early November, Klaus noticed the rock had cooled to the point where it no longer felt warm to the touch even after a fire had been burning. Instead, the rock remained at roughly the same temperature as the interior air. This was the equilibrium state he had anticipated. The rock was no longer a source of residual summer warmth, but had become a buffer, absorbing heat from fires and releasing it, gradually moderating temperature fluctuations rather than creating them. He also observed that his wood consumption had not increased despite colder weather. He was still burning approximately 3 to 4 logs per evening, occasionally adding a small morning fire if the night had been particularly cold. His neighbors, according to Herman's reports, were already burning 8 to 10 logs per day and struggling to maintain interior temperatures above freezing during the coldest nights. Klaus began feeling confident that his design would perform as he had predicted, but he also understood that the real test was still ahead. October and November, cold was manageable. December and January cold, the kind of cold that had killed Otto Brenner, would prove whether his thermal mass theory was correct or whether he had built an elaborate tomb. December of 1851 brought weather that old-timers would reference for years afterward. The first major cold snap arrived on December 7th, when temperatures dropped to 15 below zero overnight. By December 12th, the temperature had not risen above zero during daylight hours for 5 consecutive days. Night temperatures were reaching 20 below zero and colder. Klaus's shelter performed exactly as he had calculated. With his evening fire burning 4 logs over approximately 3 hours, his interior temperature stabilized at 58 degrees. The rock walls absorbed heat during the fire, then radiated it back into the living space through the night. By morning, before he lit a new fire, the interior temperature had dropped to 48 degrees. A 10-degree overnight temperature drop, while the outside temperature sat at 25 below zero. He was burning approximately 5 logs per day. His neighbors were burning 15 to 20 logs per day and barely maintaining survivable interior temperatures. Several families had begun sleeping in shifts, so someone was always awake to feed fires through the night. Missing a single fueling could allow interior temperatures to drop below freezing, threatening stored food and water supplies. Friedrich Vogel's cabin was particularly vulnerable. Friedrich had built quickly when he first claimed his land, prioritizing speed over quality. His chinking had gaps, his door fit poorly, his fireplace was inefficient. Friedrich was burning wood at an unsustainable rate and still watching frost form on his interior walls during the coldest nights. On December 18th, Klaus received a visit from Hermann Wolf and 2 other trappers. They had come not to mock, but to understand. Hermann explained that their wood supplies were being depleted faster than anticipated. If the cold continued through February, several families might not have enough wood to last the winter. They wanted to know if Klaus's design could be replicated, and if it was too late to build similar shelters before the worst cold arrived. Klaus gave them an honest assessment. His design worked because of the massive rock thermal mass. A lava tube or similar geological formation was essential. Simply building against a rock face would not provide the same benefits. The rock needed to surround the living space on 3 sides with substantial mass. He knew of 2 other lava tube formations in the region, but both were farther from established claims and would require families to relocate. The trappers left disappointed but understanding. Klaus's innovation was not easily transferable. It required specific geological features that were not universally available. For most settlers in the region, traditional construction was their only option, and they would have to survive the winter using traditional methods. But Klaus also shared practical advice. He explained heat loss pathways and how to identify and seal the worst gaps. He described efficient fire management techniques. He demonstrated how his damper system controlled draft to retain more heat. Several trappers implemented his suggestions and saw modest improvements in their cabin performance. Ernst Zimmermann arrived at Klaus's shelter on January 4, 1852. Ernst was 67 years old, a former surveyor who had come west in 1838 and established himself as a respected elder in the trapping community. He had survived more winters in the territory than anyone else present. He also owned the only precision thermometer in the region, an instrument he had carried from Boston and maintained carefully for over 20 years. Friedrich Vogel had requested that Ernst conduct an official measurement to settle the wager. Friedrich himself came with Ernst, along with Hermann Wolf and 2 other trappers who wanted to witness the results. The outdoor temperature that morning was 28 below zero, cold enough that exposed skin would freeze in minutes. Ernst began by measuring the outdoor temperature in multiple locations to establish an accurate baseline. All readings were consistent, 28 below zero. Then the group entered Klaus's shelter. The difference was immediate and dramatic. Warm air enveloped them. The interior felt not just survivable, but genuinely comfortable. Ernst placed his thermometer in the center of Klaus's living space, away from the fireplace and away from walls. He waited 10 minutes for the instrument to stabilize. The reading was 56 degrees, a difference of 84 degrees from the outdoor temperature. Klaus had a small fire burning, but it was modest, perhaps 3 logs burning quietly in the fireplace. The fire was clearly not the sole source of the interior warmth. Ernst placed his hand on the rock walls. They were warm to the touch, radiating heat that he could feel from 6 inches away. The walls themselves had become heating elements, storing energy from previous fires and releasing it constantly. The group then walked to Friedrich's cabin, approximately 2 miles away. Friedrich had left a fire burning when he departed 2 hours earlier. The fire was larger than Klaus's, consuming more wood. Ernst measured Friedrich's interior temperature. 32 degrees, barely above freezing, despite the active fire and additional wood consumption. The difference between the 2 shelters was 54 degrees. Klaus's shelter was maintaining 56 degrees with a small fire, while Friedrich's cabin struggled to stay above freezing with a larger fire. The outdoor temperature was identical for both locations. The wood consumption favored Klaus by a ratio of approximately 3-to-1. Ernst recorded all measurements in his journal, noting the date, time, outdoor conditions, fire sizes, and interior temperatures. Then he made a statement that effectively ended the debate. Based on his measurements, Klaus's shelter was performing 54 degrees warmer than Friedrich's cabin under identical outdoor conditions, and Klaus was accomplishing this while burning 1/3 the firewood. The thermal mass design was not theory, it was demonstrable physical reality. The measurement results spread through the trapping community within days. Ernst Zimmermann's reputation gave the data credibility that Klaus's own claims had lacked. Men who had mocked Klaus's cave dwelling now came to see it for themselves, wanting to understand how such dramatic temperature differences were possible. Friedrich Vogel fulfilled his wager obligation on January 10th. He came to Klaus's shelter with 6 witnesses and made a public statement acknowledging that Klaus had been correct about thermal mass, and that traditional cabin construction was demonstrably inferior for extreme cold climates. The statement was brief and clearly difficult for Friedrich to deliver, but he honored his commitment. 3 days later, Friedrich's situation became desperate. The prolonged extreme cold had forced him to burn wood at an unsustainable rate. His supply, which should have lasted through February, was nearly exhausted by mid-January. He had been rationing carefully, but rationing meant allowing interior temperatures to drop dangerously low. On the night of January 13th, temperatures outside dropped to 34 below zero. Friedrich kept his fire burning, but the cabin interior never rose above 28 degrees. His wife, Anna, and their 2 children huddled near the fireplace, wrapped in every blanket they owned. By morning, Anna's fingers showed signs of frostbite. The youngest child, 4-year-old Wilhelm, was lethargic and showing symptoms of dangerous cold exposure. Friedrich made the decision that probably saved their lives. He took his family to Klaus's shelter. Klaus took them in without hesitation. His living space was not large, but it was warm and safe. The Vogel family stayed for 3 days while the extreme cold persisted. During those days, Friedrich witnessed firsthand how the lava tube shelter functioned. He saw Klaus burn modest fires that seemed inadequate. He watched the rock walls maintain warmth long after fires died. He felt the stable temperature that never dropped below 45 degrees even during the coldest nights. On the 3rd day, Friedrich asked Klaus to explain the physics one more time. Klaus walked him through thermal mass theory, heat capacity, temperature buffering, and the fundamental difference between insulation and heat storage. Friedrich, no longer defensive or dismissive, listened carefully and asked intelligent questions. He finally understood that Klaus had not been proposing a strange lifestyle choice, but had been solving an engineering problem with scientific precision. When the cold snap broke and the Vogel family returned to their cabin, Friedrich began planning modifications. He could not relocate to a lava tube, but he began thinking about how to incorporate stone mass into his existing structure. Other trappers were having similar thoughts. Hermann Wolf visited Klaus to discuss whether a traditional cabin could be improved by building stone interior walls that would store heat. Another settler asked about creating a stone-lined root cellar beneath a cabin floor to provide thermal mass from below. Klaus shared everything he knew. He drew diagrams, explained principles, and offered practical suggestions. His design was site-specific and could not be replicated exactly, but the underlying concepts were universal. Mass stores heat. Slow thermal release moderates temperature swings. Reducing heat loss pathways improves efficiency. These principles could be applied in various ways depending on available materials and site conditions. By February of 1852, 3 additional lava tube shelters were under construction in the broader region. Word had spread beyond the immediate trapping community, reaching settlers in areas where volcanic formations were common. Hermann Wolf was building the 2nd lava tube shelter, having located a suitable formation 6 miles from his original claim. 2 other families were planning similar construction for the following spring. Hermann approached his build differently than Klaus had. He had watched Klaus work and learned from both successes and difficulties. Hermann's lava tube was larger, with interior dimensions of 14 feet by 16 feet. He positioned his front wall closer to the entrance, sacrificing some thermal mass benefit for better natural light and easier access. His door design incorporated improvements based on Klaus's experience with moisture management around the threshold. The most significant adaptation came from a settler named Thomas Whitmore, who did not have access to a lava tube, but lived near a large basalt outcrop. Thomas built his cabin against the rock face, incorporating the stone as one wall of his structure. He then built interior stone walls perpendicular to the rock face, creating a floor plan where 2 of his 4 walls were stone mass. The design was a compromise between traditional construction and Klaus's thermal mass approach, but measurements showed it performed substantially better than pure log construction. Other innovations emerged as settlers experimented with thermal mass concepts. Several families built stone fireplace surrounds that extended floor to ceiling and wall to wall, creating massive heat storage elements. One creative builder constructed a stone sleeping platform with a firebox beneath, using the thermal mass principle to create a heated bed that retained warmth through the night. Another built a double-wall cabin with the space between walls filled with small rocks, creating a thermal mass layer within the wall structure itself. Klaus became an informal consultant, visiting construction sites and offering advice. He explained which innovations would work and which would fail. He helped settlers calculate thermal mass requirements based on their cabin sizes and climate conditions. He demonstrated chinking techniques and ventilation design. His knowledge, purchased through obsessive research and careful experimentation, was freely shared with anyone who wanted to improve their survival odds. The winter of 1852 to 1853 was milder than the previous year, but the settlers, who had incorporated thermal mass principles into their shelters, reported dramatic improvements in comfort and wood consumption. Herman Wolf's lava tube shelter performed nearly as well as Klaus's. Thomas Whitmore's hybrid design reduced his wood consumption by approximately 40% compared to his previous cabin. The massive stone fireplace surrounds created noticeable warmth that persisted for hours after fires died. By 1854, thermal mass design had become accepted practice in the volcanic regions of Oregon Territory. New settlers arriving in the area specifically sought out locations near lava tubes or rock outcrops. Real estate value began factoring in proximity to suitable stone formations. Building techniques that Klaus had pioneered through necessity and obsession had become standard knowledge, taught by experienced settlers to newcomers as part of basic frontier survival education. Klaus Reinhardt lived in his lava tube shelter for 11 years. He continued trapping through the 1850s, adapting as the fur market declined and eventually shifting to hunting and selling meat to mining camps that sprang up during the gold discoveries of the late 1850s. He married in 1856 a widow named Catherine Hoffman, who moved into the lava tube shelter and found it surprisingly comfortable despite its unconventional nature. They raised 2 children in the rock shelter. Both children grew up thinking heated stone walls and stable interior temperatures were normal. They did not realize their home was unusual until they visited other families and experienced traditional cabins. Catherine added domestic improvements Klaus had never considered: curtains made from traded cloth, shelving systems that utilized natural rock alcoves, a stone-lined cold storage area in the deeper section of the tunnel. In 1862, Klaus and Catherine relocated to the Willamette Valley, where land was available for farming. Klaus was 47 years old, ready for a life less isolated and physically demanding. They built a traditional farmhouse but incorporated principles Klaus had learned. Stone fireplace mass, careful attention to heat loss pathways, strategic placement for solar gain. The house was noted by neighbors as being remarkably warm and efficient. Klaus died in 1879 at the age of 64. The obituary in the Salem newspaper described him as a farmer and former trapper, making no mention of his innovations in frontier shelter design. His children inherited the farm, and his grandchildren grew up hearing stories about the cave house in the mountains where their father and grandmother had lived. But in the mountains of Oregon, Klaus's legacy was carved into stone and memory. His original lava tube shelter remained occupied through the 1860s, then served as a way station for travelers and hunters into the 1880s. The structure required minimal maintenance because its primary components were eternal volcanic rock. Other lava tube shelters, built following his example, also remained functional for decades, outlasting traditional cabins by generations. Modern historians estimate that thermal mass construction techniques prevented at least 30 deaths from exposure during the 1850s and 1860s in the volcanic regions of the Pacific Northwest. The exact number is unknowable because survival often goes unrecorded, but accounts from the period include multiple references to families surviving extreme cold in rock shelters when traditional cabins would have been uninhabitable. The principle Klaus discovered through tragedy and necessity eventually became formalized in architectural and engineering knowledge. Thermal mass, passive solar design, heat capacity calculations, concepts that Klaus understood intuitively, became standard elements of building science. Modern sustainable architecture rediscovered principles that frontier necessity had revealed to an obsessive German trapper in 1851. Klaus Reinhardt's impossible invention was not a new tool or weapon, but a fundamental rethinking of shelter itself. He proved that working with geology rather than against it, storing heat rather than constantly generating it, and trusting mathematics over tradition could mean the difference between survival and death on the frontier. His solution required no technology, just volcanic rock, careful observation, and the willingness to be mocked while pursuing what physics promised was possible.